The Disappearance of Ashley, Kansas. No author. Sometime during the night of August 16th, 1952, the small town of Ashley, Kansas ceased to exist. At 3:28 a.m. on August 17th, 1952, a magnitude 7.8 earthquake was measured by the United States Geological Survey. The earthquake itself was felt throughout the entire state and most of the Midwest. The epicenter was determined to be directly under Ashley, Kansas. When the state law enforcement arrived at what should have been the outskirts of the farming community, they found a smoldering, burning fissure in the earth, measuring 1,000 yards in length and approximately 500 yards in width. The depth of the fissure was never determined. After 12 days, the statewide and local search for the missing 679 residents of Ashley, Kansas was called off by the Kansas state government at 9:15 p.m. on the night of August 29, 1952. All 679 residents were assumed to be dead. At 2:27 a.m. on August 30th, 1952, a magnitude 7.5 earthquake was measured by the United States Geological Survey. The epicenter was situated under what used to be the location of Ashley, Kansas. When law enforcement investigated at 5:32 a.m., they reported that the fissure in the earth had closed. In the 8 days leading up to the disappearance of the town and its 679 residents, bizarre and unexplainable events were reported by dozens of residents in Ashley, Kansas, and law enforcement from the surrounding area. On the evening of August 8th, 1952 at 7:13 p.m., a resident by the name of Gabriel Jonathan reported a strange sight in the sky above Ashley. The town itself, having no official branch of law enforcement, called into the police station of the neighboring town of Hayes. Gabriel reported what appeared to be a small black opening in the sky. Within the next 15 minutes, the Hayes police station became overwhelmed with dozens of phone calls, all reporting the same phenomenon. The phenomenon was never reported to any neighboring communities. A decision was made to send a trooper to Ashley to investigate the matter the following morning. At 7:54 a.m. on the morning of August 9th, 1952, Hayes police officer Alan Mace radioed the Hayes police station. He reported that despite following the one-way road leading to Ashley, he had become lost. According to his report, the road continued along its normal path, but somehow ended up back in Hayes. Officer Mace went on to add that the road never curved or bent in any direction. At 9:15 a.m., 7 of the town's 10 police cars were sent to investigate the situation, and all the members of the team came to the same conclusion. The only road leading into Ashley stopped leading into Ashley, but instead led back to Hayes. Phone calls continued to pour into Hayes police station, all reporting that the black opening in the sky continued to grow in size. All callers were advised to remain inside and not to travel outside unless absolutely necessary. At 8:17 p.m., Mrs. Elaine Cantor reported her neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Milton, and their 2 children, Jeffrey and Brooke, missing. According to Mrs. Cantor's phone call, the Miltons attempted to leave town in their family car earlier in the evening. They never returned. Law enforcement officials from Hayes never reported the car or individuals coming up the one-way road. At 7:38 a.m. on the morning of August 10th, 1952, phone calls from Ashley into the police station of Hayes reported that the town was in total darkness. The sun had never risen. At 10:15 a.m., at the same request of Hayes law enforcement, a helicopter from Topeka, Kansas, flew over the region in which Ashley, Kansas stood. The town was never observed from the air. At 12:43 p.m. on the afternoon of August 11th, 1952, Miss Phoebe Danielinski called into the police station. She reported that her daughter Erica had begun to have conversations with her father, who died 3 years prior in a drunk driving accident. To add to her concern, Mrs. Danielinski reported that Erica was attempting to go outside into the dark to join them. Over the course of the next 12 hours, a reported 329 phone calls were placed into the police station, all describing similar phenomenon with the children of the town. The following morning of August 12, 1952, the situation became dire. During the middle of the night, all 217 children in the town of Ashley disappeared. A reported 421 phone calls were placed into the Hayes Police Department, unable to be of any useful assistance. Hayes law enforcement instructed all callers to remain inside and to avoid any and all attempts at finding the missing children. At 5:19 p.m., on the evening of August 13, 1952, elderly man Scott Luntz reported a growing distant fire to the south. According to his description, the fire seemed to turn the distant black into the bright red and orange that seemed to extend high into the sky. Throughout the rest of the day, calls continued in, stating that the fire, in addition to moving north, now seemed to come out of the black sky. No fire was ever witnessed by any of the neighboring communities or law enforcement officials. The reports continued until 12:09 a.m. of the morning of August 14, 1952. The last phone call, placed by Mr. Benjamin Etiquette, reported that the fire in the sky had grown so immense that it appeared to be as daytime over the town. The phone call abruptly ended. From the phone call placed by Benjamin Etiquette. Benjamin:
Just hold on. Wait. Yeah, I see something. It's to the south. It looks like...
End of phone call. The next phone call wouldn't be placed until the following evening. The following is the entire transcript of the final phone call. It was placed at 9:46 p.m. on the evening of August 15, 1952. In this recorded phone call, the officer on duty is Officer Pete Welsh. The caller has been identified as Miss April Foster.
Hayes Police Department. Hello? Yes, hello? Ma'am, who am I speaking with? My name is April Foster. Please, come help me. What is happening, ma'am? Last night they came back. Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to... They came back last night! Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to calm down and speak clearly. What happened? Who came back? Everyone. Everyone? They all came back in the fire. What do you mean, everyone? My son. I saw my son last night. He was walking down the street. He was burned. Ma'am, He died last year. I raised him since he was a baby. It was just me and him. I told him to watch for cars when he rode his bike, but he never wanted to listen. Ma'am, what you're saying doesn't make any sense. You said everyone came back? Are you listening to me? Everyone. Everyone came back. Everyone who died or went missing, they're back. And they're looking for us. He said, Mommy, I'm okay now. See? I can walk again. Where are you, Mommy? I want to see you. Ma'am, where are you now? Are you safe? I'm hiding, just like everyone else. We saw them coming through the fields and some people opened their doors for them, but... Oh no. I don't know what's happened to them, but their houses caught fire and they caved in. I have my curtains drawn and I'm hiding in the closet right now. Ma'am, is everything alright? Are you okay? Ma'am? Oh my gosh! Ma'am? Something just came in. Ma'am, stay quiet as you can. Don't make a sound. Mommy? Mommy? He came inside. Stay absolutely still. Don't leave. Mommy? Mommy, where are you hiding? Stay quiet. I found you, Mommy! Ma'am? Ma'am?
End of phone call. The following morning at 6:55 a.m., the law enforcement officials of the Hays Police Department arrived at the location of Ashley, Kansas. A smoldering, burning fissure in the earth was all that remained.
Circa 2012, I was in combat training with the Marine Corps in Southern California on fire watch one night, roughly 2 a.m., with 2 Navajo guys. We got on the subject of skinwalkers and telling stories that our grandparents or others had told us. So we're all generally feeling a little creeped out just from the stories when we hear the most distorted coyote howl any of us had ever heard from what we could guess was about 50 yards away. It was like if someone was slowing down a vinyl recording of a coyote howl with their finger. We were all frozen in stark white. We just all stared at each other for a bit, sweating. We finally pointed our flashlights in the direction of the distorted howl, and we all saw what looked like a coyote head sitting on a fence post. We were just staring at it in the shaky lights, absolutely silent. The head was pointed our direction, and its eyes were open, but they didn't shine. They were just black. Finally, I say, maybe someone found a dead coyote and put its head on the post? Sometimes farmers will hang a dead coyote on a fence to keep other coyotes away. Our training was taking place on large open cattle fields. Right after I say that, the head turns slightly to the left and moves off the post. From behind the post, a coyote walks out on its hind legs with its jaw and tongue dangling like they were broken, and then just walks into the darkness out of reach of our flashlights. We all immediately shit our actual pants and book it back to where everyone was sleeping and proceeded to not sleep properly for the rest of our time out there. All 3 of us saw it, and all 3 of us know what we saw. Moral of the story: speak of the devil, and he shall appear. This happened a few years ago when me and my friends were in our junior year of high school, around 2018. There's a Dow National Forest area northwest of our small western Colorado hometown that used to be Ute land before the Meeker massacre happened and the natives were forced from the land. Being teenagers, we would frequent this area in our trucks to have bonfires, shoot targets, drink, smoke, fornicate, etc., without having to worry about law enforcement crashing our party. One night, we were having a small bonfire with a group of 4 of my close friends. Pretty quiet night. I had picked everyone up in my pickup truck, so it was the only vehicle available, and the road to the clearing was a bit treacherous, so we had to be very careful to not get stuck in the mud or trees. Throughout the night, we kept hearing what sounded somewhat like an owl, but almost like someone impersonating an owl. On top of that, owls are fairly rare in this part of Colorado. It's a very dry climate, more home to vultures and mountain lions. We heard the noise around 5 times throughout a 1-hour span, and it quickly devolved from a hoo hoo to just a singular hoo noise, similar to a gorilla sound. At this point, we were concerned, and one of my buddies taunted whatever was making the noise by repeating it back into the tree line. At this point, the sound was immediately repeated, much louder than before, as if it was just behind the tree line. We shit ourselves and everyone scrambled to the truck. I hauled ass as much as possible back to the main road. The main road was still washboard gravel, so I tried my best to channel my inner rally car driver to get us the hell out of there. On the drive down the mountain, one of my friends was riding shotgun, and the rest were sitting in the bed facing backwards. As we rounded a curve, chaos ensued. I heard screaming from the bed of the truck, and my friend sitting shotgun nearly shit herself about whatever the hell was happening back there. Instinctively, I slammed on the brakes and looked in the rear view. I didn't get a good look, but I can only describe it as a skinny, hairy humanoid creature with an arched back, sprinting across the road behind the truck on all fours. No coordination to its movement. It moved as if it was an old man trying to bear crawl at 2 times video speed. I barely had time to process before I was being screamed at to hit the gas. We finally got off the mountain, and my friends in the back of the truck appeared shell-shocked. I asked them if they saw what I saw, and they refused to answer, only saying, "Get us the F out of here." It was only afterwards, when we were at our friend's house, when they felt comfortable talking about what they saw, and everyone described it the same way. All fours, fast as hell and humanoid. 2 of the 3 described it as having long, creepy-ass fingers, eyes locked on the truck as it crossed the road. They say they saw trees and bushes moving as we drove down, as if it were trying to catch up to us. 4 years later, and the story still makes my hair stand on end when I tell it. In addition, other weird things began to happen in that forest after nightfall. We personally encountered a goat that had been killed by something, feet straight up in the air, stomach slashed in 6 equal cuts, and head nowhere to be found. I moved out of that town 3 years ago, but whenever I come back to visit, it creeps me out. I refuse to enter that area after dark, even towards sunset. Let me know what you guys think. This happened to me in January of 2019 in western North Carolina, around the small town of Silva. I was participating in a week-long program to get certified as a first responder for wilderness first aid and rescue. I'm studying to become a forester, and it's important to know how to keep people alive in the woods when things go wrong. There are 2 primary locations in the complex: a classroom with some bathrooms, and a kitchen where we spent most of the day in class and ate meals, and a group of 1-room cabins on top of a steep hill directly north of the classroom where we would sleep. An important thing to note about the cabins is the heating system. Each cabin has a small but powerful radiator in it that makes the cabin feel like a sauna if left on for too long. Since it was January in the Appalachians, it was pretty chilly outside at night, so the heat was needed. In order to strike balance between boiling in our beds and getting hypothermia, we would turn on the radiator and leave a window open so that warm and cold air could circulate and create a reasonable temperature. The radiator and the open window were at the front of the cabin, next to the door, and my bed was directly across from the window. The incident happened on the 5th day, a Thursday, of my time there. My boyfriend and I, who was enrolled in the program with me, had settled down for the night in the cabin we shared with 1 other person. We had gone to sleep as normal and were sleeping soundly on 2 bunks that were pushed together so we could sleep next to each other. Sometime during the night, I was woken up by some shuffling on the other side of the room near the window. I heard my boyfriend say in a complaining voice, "Can't we close this window? I wake up feeling frozen." I woke up more and sat up in my bed groggily. I was about to answer him when I heard another voice say, "If we close the window, it'll get too hot and we'll wake up sweaty." I snapped awake and froze where I was sitting. The voice that had responded was my voice. There's something very strange and wrong in hearing your own voice repeated back at you. In the dark, I looked down next to me where I saw my boyfriend sleeping soundly. At this point, a mortal dread had a tight grip on my chest, and I forced myself to not move or even blink. I was focused intently on the place near the window, fearfully anticipating more of my own words. I heard more shuffling outside the window, and my same words were repeated. If we close the window, it'll get too hot and we'll wake up sweaty. Followed quickly by my boyfriend's voice again. Can't we close this window? I wake up feeling frozen. Towards the end of the last repetition of my boyfriend's words, there seemed to be an unevenness in the enunciation, like raising and lowering the pitch slightly. I remained frozen in my bed, feeling my hand fall asleep in my propped up position. I sat there for what felt like 15 or 20 minutes, listening to whatever it was shuffle around in front of our window, separated from me by some odd 10 feet in window mesh. Eventually, the shuffling became more frequent, and a weird mumbling sound came from outside the window, with no real words being said, or none that I could make out. This particular behavior didn't last long before the shuffling sound moved to the left of the window to the door, where a scratching sound began to manifest. As the sound moved, I saw the silhouette of a medium height, 5'6", figure that moved in an uncanny way, like when a baby animal tries to walk for the first time, but isn't quite strong enough to stand up correctly. It sounded like someone was scraping some dry sticks against the wood of the door, not aggressively, but kind of like an impatient dog asking to be let in. The scratching slowly moved around the cabin, stopping when it reached the wall that I was closest to. My ears were strained to hear anything that might indicate further action, but all I could hear were footsteps on the dry leaves. The footsteps eventually moved away from the cabin and down the other side of the hill, and didn't return for the rest of the night. I stayed unmoving from my position for at least another half an hour before my body readjusted itself slightly, letting blood flow back into my asleep limbs. I was wide awake until my boyfriend's and other roommates' alarm went off sometime before dawn to get ready for the day, which felt like maybe 2 hours, but I couldn't be certain because I didn't have a clock. My boyfriend was surprised that I was awake before him, as I'm typically a later sleeper, but I just told him his alarm woke me up and tried to act somewhat normal. We got up and got ready for our day, but I refused to leave the cabin until the sun began to peek over the mountains. For the rest of the week, I was on edge and felt like there were eyes on me whenever it was relatively dark out, though I'm not sure how much of that was raw paranoia. In the day following the incident at night, I had realized the lines that were repeated to me by the voice were a part of a conversation that my boyfriend and I had had earlier in the week, and I came to the conclusion that whatever it was had been outside our cabin and heard us talking. This scared me a great deal, as I also realized that it had likely been lurking there in the following nights as well without us realizing it, and might do so again for our remaining nights, though it ended up not coming back. I waited to tell my boyfriend about this until we had left the program because he scares easy and was already a little wary of walking in the woods at night up to the cabins. It should be noted that I know this to not be a sleep paralysis experience, as I've had them before and they were nothing like this, not to mention I was able to move. I'm posting this here also as a means of asking for advice, in addition to getting it off my chest, as this winter I'll have to return to the same location to renew my certification, and I want to know as much as I can, so I can hopefully avoid another encounter. I'm a 43-year-old man, a former Marine with a lot of time at sea, and a former railroader, so I've been to a lot of places that are just hard to get to for most folks. I've never seen anything like what we saw last night, and it happened on Highway 50 in between Penrose and Pueblo, Colorado. My wife was working a closing shift in Cannon City last night. I left Pueblo and made the drive west as usual. After she clocked out, we went to pick up our son from his job, only to find he wasn't working last night. On the drive back from Cannon, you pass Penrose, and then there's a place I've always called the Big Hole. The Big Hole is actually called Pierce Gulch. There's a significant drop in elevation, and then you immediately climb back out, hence the nickname. As we were approaching Big Hole at about 12:40 a.m., something traveling from north to south crossed all 4 lanes and median of Highway 50 at an incredible rate of speed. We were the only vehicle out there at this time of night, and we nearly hit it. It was roughly 3 feet tall and had long brown hair everywhere. And again, this thing was hauling ass, faster than any animal I'd ever seen or heard of. My wife was driving and had our son on speakerphone. She startled and looked at me as if to ask what the hell was that. By this time, we were down in the bottom of the gulch and headed back up the hill. We told our son what we saw and she got off the call. We discussed it for a second and decided to go back and see if maybe it had gotten caught in the barbed wire fence or something. Maybe there were some traces of this thing. We were both amazed by how fast it was moving. By 12:45, we had traveled back to the west side of the gulch and turned around. There wasn't any traffic, so my wife just slowly rolled down the shoulder of the highway, and I had my window down and was shining a flashlight that I had in the car out into the field. There isn't much out there except cactus and stuff. As we came up on the approximate area we saw this thing, I told my wife, "Hey, look, do you see those eyes?" She said yes and stopped the car. 10 yards or so on the other side of the fence was a pair of very bright, very blue eyes, not far off the ground. I was thinking we probably were looking at a coyote or something. It was looking directly back at us. What happened next, I will never forget as long as I live. Whatever those eyes belonged to stood up like a man, like a 6.5 to 7 foot man. They were still looking at us. Whatever it was that flew across the road at like Mach 2, this was it. This was the hairy thing we saw. There was a moment of disbelief and shock, and then it registered that we found the thing, and it wasn't just some animal. The fear kicked in. I told my wife, "Go, go, go, just get out of here." It seemed like slow motion. She floored the gas, and the thing watched us leave. We already knew that this thing was incredibly fast, so she drove as fast as she could up and out of the gulch, and I was looking out the back window and checking mirrors. My wife was afraid it might be following us. It wasn't, and I didn't want to make things worse by admitting that I was worried too. We drove very fast for several minutes. We talked, but it was like we were talking to ourselves, like, "Oh my God, what the hell was that? And was it waiting for us?" Soon the lights from Pueblo West were ahead, and we were back in civilization. Once we got into the city, we finally started to relax a little. We talked until we got home, and then checked the car for anything. We couldn't really go to sleep for hours. My wife got online and was searching for anything that matched the creature we saw. She found some stories, paranormal in nature, of other people witnessing a creature that sounded exactly like the one we had seen. She has to work the same shift tonight, so on our way out to Cannon City, we're going to stop and go out into the field where we saw the thing and see if there's any evidence, footprints or hair or something. I'll update this if I find anything unusual.
The House That Death Forgot. Written by Josh Parker. Melinda hated driving at night. She did her best to avoid it. Short trips to the store if she realized that she ran out of tampons or had nothing for dinner after getting home. That sort of thing happened now and then. But she did her best not to go out after dark unless someone was coming to pick her up. So naturally, she found herself on the longest drive of her life tonight, with no moon, few stars, swirling clouds above her, and acres of forest on either side. As so many unpleasant things in her life, this was her father's fault. She hadn't seen or spoken to the man in 15 years, but just after falling asleep tonight. No, that was wrong. It would have been yesterday by this time. Out of the blue, her phone rang, and his voice was on the other end.
"I need you, Millie. Please come now."
He said just that, and then the line went dead. The old man was probably drunk, but he'd never called before. Not since she was a child, and he was still trying to convince her mother to take him back. It felt like she had been dreaming, waking up to hear his voice again after all these years. It sounded like he was crying. His voice sounded just the same as she'd last heard it. As though in a dream she had risen, dressed, and gotten in the car. She was well out of town and halfway to his old place before realizing that she had no way of knowing if he even still lived there. She received updates from her mother from time to time over the years about where he was. The last time she'd heard from her mother about him was 7 years ago. Had he even stayed in one place that long? Not to her recollection. She had been 7 when her mother finally had enough and showed him the door. Prior to that, a move had come every few months. The house that they'd been living in was their longest stay in one place, a full 16 months. It turned into 2 years after that, and then the next house had been the one she left when she moved out on her own. In all that time, she heard from him sporadically at best, and had finally decided it was best to simply forget about him. Until tonight. She had found out after a 2-hour drive that she had been right to wonder if he was still living in the same place. His last known address was a sketchy apartment in a low-income area of town she had grown up in. Had he been number 24 or number 42? Maybe he was 14. It definitely had a 4 in it, but it didn't matter. His name wasn't on any of the buzzers. Her drunk of a father had called her at night, all but demanding she come to him for reasons he didn't feel were important enough to tell her over the phone, and then just expected that she knew where he lived now. In a flurry of rage, she turned back and marched to her car, slamming the door and starting off in the direction she came. She was so angry, she didn't even look where she was going and missed her turnoff. The next thing she knew, she was on this lonely stretch of road. Cars were sparse, but she took comfort in the fact that she would pass one every half hour or so. Her dashboard clock now read 2:27 a.m. She had been driving for more than 5 hours since leaving her house at night. Every 5 minutes or so, she checked her cell phone. Ever since realizing she was lost, she had checked her phone and found no bars at all. She even stopped at a gas station, closed of course, just sure that there'd be some service around here somewhere. But nothing. Take stock of your life, Millie, she thought. You're over 30, you hate your job, you and your mother don't get along, you haven't seen or spoken to your father in just under half your life. You have no time for friends or a relationship thanks to your aforementioned job, which you hate, and now here you are. Trapped on a road you've never been on before, at night, and you can't even so much as call AAA, let alone Google Maps. Smart lady you are. She briefly considered stopping and flagging down the next car that passed. She quickly realized the futility of that plan. Any car on this road would have had no service also, so there was nothing for it. She'd have to drive until she saw a house. She'd feel bad for waking someone up, but there was no choice. She needed to find her way back to the main highway. But so far, all that she could see on either side were trees. Mile after mile of trees. No light shining through the burrows. No sign that anyone had ever been here before except that there was a road, and people were obviously still driving on it. There weren't even any road signs other than mile markers. Had she really found the middle of nowhere? She was just in the middle of this thought when her headlights illuminated something just up the road. A square wooden sign, obviously made by someone other than the government. This wasn't a gas, food, lodging sign, or a mile marker, or a distance to sign. This looked like the kind of sign advertising a business that was nearby. She slowed down to read it. Granny Royce, Roadhouse. Come stay the night at Granny's. She'll take good care of you. Room, board, low prices. Next exit. Her heart sped up. She certainly wasn't interested in spending the night at Granny Royce, but every business had a phone. Or at the very least, she'd have a map, or know the way back to the highway. She decided she'd stop there. She'd almost missed the turn. Granny Royce Roadhouse was buried at the back of a long dirt driveway, secluded amid the trees. She was almost past the little dirt road that led back to it before realizing it was there. She skidded to a stop and turned in. The little house laid ahead. It was 2 stories and looked to have about 8 to 10 rooms. Big for a home, but small for anything announcing room and board. She got closer and looked for a vacancy sign. Nothing. It wasn't even that the sign wasn't lit. There was no sign. The porch light was on, and the front of the building was illuminated by that light and by her headlights. No signs of any kind. She almost wondered if she had gotten the wrong place, but she was certain that she had seen no other exits between this house and the sign announcing it. There's no one here but me, she thought. At this point, she wouldn't be surprised to find the house empty as well, but the light was on and this was supposed to be a roadhouse. Someone would be manning the front desk. She got out of her car and headed for the front porch. As she turned around to make sure the lights flashed when she hit the lock button on her fob, she thought she could see a flash of movement in the trees. Something human-shaped. She stopped and looked again. Nothing. She decided she imagined it. At the front door, she hesitated. If this really was a roadhouse, then she would be able just to go in. But what if she got the wrong house? If she tried the door and just walked in, she could find herself arrested, out here in the middle of nowhere. Cautiously, she tried the knob. It turned. She pressed gently on the door. It opened. Relief flooded through her when she saw that she was in a small but tastefully decorated foyer that had obviously been repurposed as an administration area. A quaint desk with an honest-to-God guest book had been placed in the far right corner, and some chairs had been set out, along with some magazines on a table. She read the titles briefly: Mademoiselle, Blue Book, The New Country Life, Arts and Architecture, before turning her attention to the little desk. There wasn't a computer. That was a cute touch. It was like the house was from a past era. Perhaps old Granny Royce really didn't like modern technology. There was, however, a little bell, just like there would have been in 1929. It wasn't even the round silver kind you slapped a ring. It was the little porcelain handbell. This place was starting to out-cute her. Please let her have a phone, and please let it use the number plan, not the 1950s exchange. She picked up the bell and gave it a shake. For a while, nothing happened. Then she saw a light come on in the back room, and the shadow of an old woman sprang up on the wall. The shadow moved towards her, and within a few seconds, she saw its owner, Granny Royce, who perhaps looked like every grandmother in every storybook ever.
"Well, goodness me," she said. "My lands. Good morning, dearie. Pardon my tardiness, but it's been a while since we got guests at this hour. Can I take your name, honey?"
Granny Royce was smallish, her gray hair tied in a neat bun behind her head. A dress that would have looked like it belonged to a senior citizen in the 20s. A pink and faded sweater. Melinda thought that she looked just like she would have wanted her own grandmother to look like. But her mother's mother had died when she was young, and she never met her father's mother. It almost hurt to deny this sweet little woman her business, but nevertheless, she had to get home. "Actually, I'm sorry," she began, "but the fact is I'm lost. I'm not even sure where I am in the direction of—"
"Oh, you poor thing,"
said Granny Royce.
"You just sit down and let me fix you some tea or something. You must be cold."
"Really, thank you, but I'm okay," Melinda said gently. "I just need to use the phone if I could, or if you've got a map even, that would be lovely. I really only live a couple hours from here." She trailed off, not knowing if she was even right about that. She easily could have driven those 5+ hours in the wrong direction entirely.
"Oh dear,"
said the little woman sadly. I'm sorry, honey, but the phone lines are down. As for a map, well, I used to have one, and if I look, I still might, but it's probably quite out of date by now. The highway's moved since then. I know that much. Melinda's heart sank. How could her luck get any worse? No phone, cell, or landline, and no map. What could she do? She had to get back home. She was expected to be at work at 8 a.m. tomorrow, and why were the phone lines down? The weather was coldish but clear. Were they fixing a line nearby? She told Granny Royce the name of her town, but Granny only said, "Believe it or not, I'd never heard of that town. What did you say the name was?" She told her again. "No, doesn't ring a bell. I'm sorry, but I could not say which direction it is. Why don't you stay the night, sweetie? I'll give you a discount for your trouble." "Thank you. That's very kind of you, but I have work tomorrow and I need to get back home. I'm not even sure why I'm even out tonight. The only reason I had doesn't seem to matter anymore." "Honey, I wouldn't advise trying to drive back that far tonight," Granny Royce said. "Why, it's almost 3 in the morning, and you've not had any sleep. Maybe the lines will be up in the morning, and you can call your work and let them know that you'll be late." "That won't work either," she replied. "I'm the opener. No one will be there. No, I'm sorry, I really have to leave. I'll head in the other direction until I find the road I was on." At that moment, Granny Royce's expression, already one of concern, seemed to shift somewhat to one of fear. She paused, looking at Melinda as though she wanted to say something else to keep her inside. Finally, she said, reluctantly, "All right, honey. If you're sure, just be careful now. Don't speak to nobody until you're back on the road." That last little warning seemed to be silly. After all, what was Melinda, a little girl? She thanked Granny Royce for her kindness and headed back to the car. About halfway to the car, she remembered thinking she saw someone moving in the trees. Her eyes scanned both sides of the secluded little cleared area she was in, looking for anything that appeared to be moving on its own, rather than being blown by the slight wind. She saw nothing. Satisfied, she headed to her car. All 4 tires were flat. She leaned down and saw long slash marks along each tire. Someone in the little slice of green acres had slashed her tires, and the time it took her to find out that she had no way of contacting anyone tonight. Kids from the local farmhouse. Gotta be, she thought grimly. Nothing else to do, so you might as well go out at night and slash tires. She stopped and let that reality sink in. She wasn't going anywhere tonight. She had no choice now. She had to stay the night here until morning, when hopefully the phone lines would be up and she could call someone from work to ask them to go in for her. And then AAA to deal with her tires. She sighed and walked back to the house. She could hear Granny Royce as she was walking back to her room. She had already turned off the lights. Resigned to her fate, Melinda rang the little bell again. "That you, miss?" she heard Granny Royce call. "Yes, it's me," she answered. "Sorry to bother you. My name's Melinda Orton. Sorry I never mentioned it before. I guess I'll take a room for the night, if the offer's still good." "Oh, of course it is, dearie," said Granny Royce, re-entering the room and turning the lights back on. "Melinda, oh, that's such a pretty name, honey. Well, let's get you situated. You put your name and your arrival time in the book there, and I'll get you a key. All the boarding rooms are on the 2nd floor, and there's only a couple left." "There are other people here?" This was surprising. Not a single car had been in the front lawn when she pulled in. "Oh, yes, Miss Melinda." Granny was puttering around in the adjacent room. "Mr. Norris, young Calvin, there's a few of us here." She came back out with the key in her hand. "Just out of curiosity, what made you change your mind?" She seemed to brighten as she asked the question, as though relieved that Melinda would stay after all. "Oh, it's probably just local kids getting kicks," she said. "But I found my tires to be slashed." Granny stopped suddenly, her face twisted with concern and worry. Then she resumed as though nothing was wrong. Nothing to be done for it, I suppose, she said with an air of sadness. Well, not until morning at any rate, said Melinda. Then hopefully the lines will be up. Oh, said Granny Royce distractedly. Yes, hopefully. She led Melinda up the darkened staircase into an empty, quiet hall. Or perhaps not so quiet. From one end of the hall came the muffled sound of someone crying. Whoever it was crying softly, not with an anger or petulance or fear, but with deep sadness. It sounded as if crying was something this person was used to, but they were still unable to stop. Who is that? She asked, pointing in the direction the crying was coming from. Oh, pay no mind, honey, said Granny. That's just Mr. Norris. He's been like that a while. Older man, you'd understand. Not all there. She tapped her temple. I understand, Melinda replied, but wondered privately how an old out-of-touch man would wind up at a roadhouse. Has he been there long? A while, I'd say, Granny answered. I don't really recall how long exactly. How does he pay for room and board? I guess he doesn't drive, she said to the old woman. Actually, it doesn't look like anyone else here has a car. Granny started at this, looking up with an almost guilty expression. Oh well, she said. That kind of thing is the business of our guests. I don't ask about such things. She turned the key in the lock of the room she had led Melinda to, and opened the door. Turning on the light, she showed Melinda the quaint little room. Melinda thought it looked like stepping into the past. She could swear that this room would have looked modern in the early 50s, at the earliest. Come to think of it, so could the rest of this place, she thought. No wireless service, no computer, that old bell. And those magazines, they looked new, but that thought was cut off by Granny putting the key on the nightstand and started in with the instructions. Now, the bathroom's down the hall there. You'll be sharing the whole floor, so bear in mind that if you have to go. There's a shower schedule on the door as well. First come, first serve. You just add your name to the first available line, and that's the order the showers are in. I wouldn't worry about that if I were you, though. I'm sure you'll be first in line. I get up at 6 a.m. sharp every morning and start breakfast. But you come on down whenever you're ready and I'll whip up something for you. Oh, and one last thing, my dear. I would strongly advise you to not leave the house until sunup. You just never know what could happen out there, in the dark. Of course, she replied. I'd never go anywhere in the dark if I didn't have to. She stopped that train of thought right out of the gate. After a few moments, she was alone. Alone without anything to wear to bed, and nothing to shower, brush her teeth, or hair with in the morning. She sat on the bed and looked out the window, which faced front. Her car still sat where she had left it, the only thing for miles that seemed like part of her world. An expensive, overly large paperweight, until I can get a hold of someone, she thought bitterly. Despite the hominess of the room, she felt an unwillingness to rise and shut off the lights. Somehow the thought of going to sleep in this backward little room seemed unthinkable. So instead she continued to sit and stare out the window. A figure in black detached itself from the shadows of the trees and made its way to the car. What? She jumped up and ran to the window. The figure was tall and seemed to be wearing a cloak made of night. She saw its arm extend. In its hand was a long, jagged dagger. It dragged the dagger across the side of her car, leaving a long gash mark in the paint and metal. Hey, she shouted. The figure kept dragging the dagger. She reached for the window to open it. It wouldn't budge. She looked for a lock, but couldn't see one. Hey, she yelled again. This time the figure raised its head. She could see the glint of two eyes under the hood. The figure raised the dagger slowly and determined. It pointed it straight at her face. She leapt away from the window and ran for the door. A noise on the other side stopped her. Footsteps, dragging, shambling footsteps, and crying. The sound of a person for whom deep, longing sadness is a way of life. Mr. Norris. She waited. Somehow, She felt that she should let the old man pass before she opened the door. Before he got very far, however, she heard other footsteps. These, much quicker and lighter, run up the stairs and stop near the door of her room.
"Stop it!"
hissed Granny Royce.
"Go back to your room right now. You know better. She can't see you yet. Hopefully she won't have to at all. Now go back in there. You've got no business being out at this hour anyways."
What on earth? How could that sweet old woman talk to another human that way, let alone an old man with a foggy mind? She almost opened the door right then, but somehow her hand stopped and waited until the shuffling, crying man had made his way back down the hallway. She heard his door open. She opened her own door just in time to see his foot, shod in a well-worn house shoe, slide into his room. The door closed softly after him. That poor man, she thought. But now she was determined to find out what was going on. The punk outside in a Halloween costume slashing up her car, followed by Granny yelling at an old man, made her begin to understand that not all was well here. She went back down to the front desk area, which was completely unlit except for the moonlight and the porch light coming through the window. There was, however, a light on near the back room that Granny Royce had emerged from. Melinda paused to take a look outside the front window. The maniac with the dagger was nowhere to be seen for the moment, but she was now determined that it was he that she had seen moving in the trees. He could have killed me. She strode in the direction of the light, seeing that it was the light of the kitchen. She kept going, expecting to find Granny Royce still puttering around with whatever an old innkeeper did with herself during the early hours of the morning. Instead, she found Granny sitting with a young man of about 20. He had dark hair and a scruff of stubble and was wearing a dark brown corduroy shirt and khakis, along with a pork pie hat. He looked like he was ready to go sell some newspapers on a street corner in the 30s. He was quietly sipping tea while Granny was admonishing him from the other end of the table.
"Now that was a horrible thing to say," she said. "When I was your age, young men minded their manners."
"That's a laugh, talking about my age," muttered the young man with a sneer.
"And just how old are you? Do you even remember? Calvin Davidson, you are trouble, young man," she hissed back. Neither had noticed Melinda yet. "One of these days you're gonna say something you'll regret."
"Oh, come on, Granny. What could I possibly say that will make things worse than they already are?" demanded Calvin. "I mean, look at old Mr. Norris up there. Both of us are just hello, miss. I didn't know we had anyone else here." He had just seen Melinda.
Hi,"
she said. She had the feeling she'd walked into an old argument the two of them had had many times, and that did not concern her. Her fear and anger were forgotten for the moment. Calvin had been talking to Granny like a sullen kid, but something about what they were saying seemed wrong.
"Can I help you, Melinda?"
asked Granny Royce.
"Is there something wrong with your room?"
That brought her back. "No," she said. "The room is fine, but nothing else is. I mean, what on earth do you even have a roadhouse out here where it seems like no one ever stops? Why are most of your rooms full every night even though mine is the only car there? Why did I hear you talk to Mr. Norris like he was a dog? And why would you want to make sure I didn't see him?" She got no further before Calvin cut her off. "Goodness, she's not even here tonight and she can already see it. Why don't you even let her in, Granny? Why don't you just bolt the door? Heck, if I could go take down that sign, don't you think I would have by now? Lord love a duck." "There's something you don't hear many young men saying," thought Melinda. She decided to ignore Calvin for the moment, otherwise. "And besides that, there's someone out there. He's the freak who slashed my tires and he's been out there messing up my car since then. And you guys can't even call the police. Are you gonna tell me that you've never had vandals out here before?" There was a long pause in the room. Neither Granny nor Calvin seemed willing to break it. Calvin scratched at his neck. For the first time, Melinda noticed a red slash at his throat, half hidden by his collar. It looked like either a very fresh scar or a slightly healed one. "Listen, miss, I don't know your name," he said. "Melinda," she finally told him. Melinda, he repeated. Melinda, I think you should sit down. I have something to tell you that you might find troubling. Melinda did not like how he said that. She also did not like the way his tone had switched from sullen child to serious adult. He looked several years her junior, but he was talking to her as if he was her uncle, or her boss. He swallowed a sip of tea and sighed. Then he looked at her straight in the face and said, "The reason I don't have a car out here is that when I got here, no one my age nor no one in my line of work would have owned a car. It would have seemed like an impossible dream." "What? What are you talking about?" she asked hesitantly. "I worked in the textile mill," he said. "The mill was shut down the time I got here. Most businesses were. So I struck out on my own, a drifter looking for work for whatever I could find. And I stopped here. Forever." "Businesses were shut down? I don't understand," said Melinda. "We're having a rough time of it now, but businesses are mostly staying open." "Not then they weren't," said Calvin sadly. "I arrived here in 1929. Melinda blinked. Something had exploded behind her eyes. "This place was new then," said Granny. "My man and I had just opened it, and young Mr. Calvin was a sweet young lad of 16. I offered to take him on as a hired help over my husband's objections. Well, my husband was a well-meaning man, but he knew how to pinch a penny. 'Twas a year after I took on Calvin that Mr. Royce died. Calvin and I had been here ever since, and every few years or so, someone joins us." "Yep," Calvin broke in. "Miss Tilly was first. She was a woman of ill repute who ran here, pregnant and scared that the man who'd run her up trade in New York was going to find her and kill her. She and that baby." He broke off, now seeming on the point of tears. "And then," said Granny, "there was Mr. Standish. He was a traveling minister. He doesn't travel anymore." "Mr. Norris got here in '69, said Calvin. "His story is probably the worst. He was a bank robber, you see. Carried a pistol, and he didn't like learning how long he'd been here." He paused, stood and walked to the kitchen window. "He tried to leave on his own, you see. He ain't the first to try it. That was me, actually. I warned him not to go out and try, but he wouldn't listen. But when he got outside, and he met him..." "Calvin," hissed Granny, "we don't talk about this." "She's gotta know," said Calvin. "There's no point in her finding out slowly." "There's still a chance for her," said Granny in a stage of whisper. "All she has to do is wait until morning." "She's not gonna wait until morning," said Calvin, with some remorse in his voice. "No one ever waits until morning. The fact that she came down here is proof enough of that. Besides, what good would that have really done for her? Her car is useless. We have no phone here. There was no phone when this place went up, and there won't ever be one. You know that." "Okay, everyone stop," Melinda shouted. "That's enough. Now you can't keep me prisoner here, and I have no intentions of staying any longer. Only that knife-wielding maniac out there is keeping me from running down this road this minute. Now I need to know, what's really going on here? I need to know it now." "We've been telling you," Calvin said. "Granny may not want you to know everything, but you need to, because you won't be leaving. Oh, and we're not trying to keep you prisoner. I don't even care if you run out that door now, but you'll never leave this house again afterwards." "Like hell I won't," yelled Melinda. "Listen, child," said Granny, rising from her spot at the table. "Listen, please. None of us mean you any harm, not even Mr. Norris. There's nothing we can do anymore, and he knows it. That's why he's up here crying all the time. We're stuck here, all of us. I hope there's a chance for you to run in the morning, but Calvin's right. There's no guarantee you'll be safe in the morning anyhow." "What the hell is this place?" choked out Melinda. She was beginning to break down. She could feel the tears welling in her eyes. "It was about a month after Mr. Royce died," said Calvin, "when he came. He was wearing that long black robe and carrying that ridiculous dagger. I saw him when I was trimming the hedges in the back. I told him he needed to get out of here because I didn't like his look. He moved so fast I never saw it coming. And he got me from here. Calvin touched his neck. To here. He touched his lower abdomen on the opposite side of his neck slash. He began to undo his shirt. Melinda almost vomited. Under his shirt was a long, ugly slash that went deep and was still seeping blood. She could see the bone and muscle and intestines wriggling around within. I died that night, said Calvin. But then I didn't. The next thing I knew, I was being dragged into the house by Granny, and when I woke up, I nearly scared her to death. She was sure that I was gone. The thing is, I was. But I was awake. I could talk, walk, do anything I could do while alive. Well, except take my enjoyment or nourishment from food or drink anymore. I still drink that tea because it keeps my skin from turning ash gray. I learned that about 15 years ago. He didn't go away, though, Granny broke in. I went out to deal with him, carrying my axe. He took my axe and buried it in my back. I won't show you the wound, honey. Calvin shouldn't have shown you his either. No one should have to see it. But that's how he works, Melinda, continued Calvin. He got that knife, but if you try to use a weapon on him, he just moves like he does and takes it from you. You never stand a chance. He'll use whatever weapon you try to take him down with to end you. Mr. Norris learned that the hard way. This is not happening. Melinda was ready to break down. She had to hold it together. She had to get out of here, somehow. Nothing about this was right. Nothing about it could be real. It was all a dream. Too much didn't make sense. Her father calling her out of the blue, her leaving to go to him without a second thought, getting lost so quickly and so irreversibly. No cell phone service anywhere on this road. This place, everything about it. She was dreaming. That had to be it. But if so, she was going to survive this dream. She turned and ran for the stairs. Her purse was still in her room, but she was going to grab it and go. She had enough. Protesting voices began babbling behind her. She cared not one whit. Mr. Norris was waiting at the top of the stairs. Contrary to Granny Royce's description of him, he was not that old at all. No more than about 40. But she saw instantly what she meant by not all there. The top half of Mr. Norris's head looked normal, like a reasonably attractive man with dark hair peppered with gray here and there. His eyes, a clear green, were moist with fresh tears. The lower half of his face was a ruin of bone fragments, shredded muscle and blood. So much blood. His left side was similarly destroyed. His arm hung on a few hanging strings of muscle. His hip was just as much a mess of bone and blood as his face was. He kept his one good hand on a banister as he shuffled towards her. Behind him stood a young woman in a bra and a pair of panties. Her stomach was cut open, and looking out of the wound with bright, intelligent eyes were the mangled remains of a baby. Melinda turned and bolted for the front door. Her hand had just closed around the knob when Calvin rushed up to her, placing his freezing cold hand over hers. "They're not going to hurt you," he said quickly. "But he will. If you step out for so much as a moment, he will kill you. And it will hurt. And it will go on hurting. Forever. After a while, you learn to function with the pain, but it never goes away." Sobbing, she asked the question that she'd been afraid to ask since coming here. "Who is he?" "We don't know," said Granny from behind Calvin. "He just came here, and he won't go away. He likes to watch us and do things to incite us to come out again. As soon as someone does, he hurts them more. But no matter how many times he kills us, we won't die. Believe me when I say we all wish we could." Melinda had had enough of this. She pushed Calvin away and threw open the door. He was standing on the porch. The knife was held out in front of him, just at face level. Melinda ran into him at a rush, the knife puncturing her right eye and its tip sliding on through, out the other side. She just managed to see the grinning, pure white face of her killer before everything went black. A few hours later, the house erupted with screams from upstairs as Melinda woke to a world of pain, the likes of which she had never known.